Hello, I would like to present my analysis of the text I've chosen, which is the text called Justified and Ancient. And as you can see on the screen, I have created a short outline of the points which I would like to discuss during my analysis. So first of all, I would like to give a short summary of the text. The text is a short story from the year 2000 written by Simon Lewis, and the story takes place in India in an old small ethnic village near Delhi. The protagonist of the story, Lee, is a British guy who is visiting India, and he is on a guiding tour hiking in the mountains to a village. And Lee doesn't seem very interested in the village and Indian culture in general. He is more determined to return to Delhi. And together with his guide Punchy, he meets the president of the village, whom he buys a big amount of marijuana. And when the deal is done, Lee wants to leave the village quickly and return to a more familiar environment. So the next point, the first point I would like to discuss is the setting of the story. Um, and as I mentioned during the summary, the story takes place in this old village, and I have found a quotation which describes the village. As you can see here, the village was a cluster of wooden huts fringing the summit. So this quotation indicates that it's a very primitive village and a underdeveloped village. There's no electricity or satellite television or anything like that. And we are also informed that the village is a sacred and holy place. And you get the impression that it's a village with a lot of traditions. And yeah. And the village also seems very different from the Western culture, which is exaggerated through the character Lee and his impression of the place. Um, and it's seen, for example, in the start where Lee is more interested in his Sibyl than discovering the village, which is also shown in this next quotation I've chosen. The only mechanical device he had seen all day, it seemed invested with significance, and its smooth operation was reassuring. Um, so Lee prefers to play with his lighter because it's something familiar. Um, it's something that reminds him of his home or something like that. He prefers to do that rather than discovering this new culture and this new village. Yeah, so you could say that the lack of electricity makes the village uninteresting to Lee, who prefers to play with his light instead. And the next point is the narrator and point of view. The author have chosen to use a third person narrator, and it's also an omniscient narrator, which indicates that the narrator is aware of all the characters' thoughts and feelings. Um, and it gives the reader an insight into different perspectives in the story. For example, we have on the one side, we have the awareness of Lee's opinions and thoughts and feelings throughout the story, but in the meantime, we also get the villagers' point of view through a woman who describes Lee, which I will get back to later on in my analysis. But first of all, I would have a look at the language. The language is highly characterized by dialogue. There's a lot of dialogue throughout the story mainly between Lee, Punchy, the guide, and the villagers or the president of the village. And I think the dialogue makes the general tone of the story very casual and informal. um, and the author hasn't made use of many stylistic devices either. There is, however, a couple of rhetorical questions which where I've chosen to show one of them here. Lee suspected that the old man disapproved strongly of this, but what did he care? Which is one of the examples of the rhetorical questions in the story. But other than that, there isn't really many stylistic devices in the short story. Yeah. And moving on, I would like to take a closer look to the main character Lee. Yeah, and as a reader, you do not get a very positive impression of Lee. He seems very ignorant towards the ancient village and their values and culture. He doesn't seem interested in the foreign culture. And when visiting the village, Lee can't wait to get back to Delhi to sleep on a mattress, watch MTV in cafes, and talk to other white people or other people like him. Um, and Lee is very narrow-minded towards the villagers. He generalizes them and finds them less intelligent than himself because he's from the West. And Lee also seems to find himself superior to the villagers because of their lack of electricity, satellite television, and well, just development in general. And he only pretends to be interested in the present stories, but he only do that because he hopes to get the marijuana at a cheaper price, it seems. But on the other hand, the villagers don't seem to approve of Lee either. As I mentioned earlier, there's a woman who describes Lee, and I have chosen to I would like to read out her description of Lee, which you can see here on the screen. He looked very male with his thick, hairy arms and big neck, but he had a woman's hair hanging down his back. He had soft, fleshy hands that had never worked. He was big with food and hungry all the time. He did not wash and keep himself clean, as a good person should. His pink skin turned red in the sun. He was not polite to women. So this quotation shows that the woman from the village kind of categorizes Lee as this typical arrogant Western guy who looks disgusting, hasn't worked a day in his life, at least not physically, and doesn't treat women well. So she gives us an insight in her view on Lee and a description of his looks. Which also leads me on to the theme and message of the short story, and the main theme of the text is cultural differences. The author disposes a cultural clash between the West and the East, and the character Lee is here used as a symbol for a stereotypical Western man who's very materialistic, ignorant, and doesn't really care about the environment or other people. He only seems to care about himself. And the Eastern people are, on the other hand, represented as kind and honest people who enjoy their simple life in a primitive village. So the author creates this strong contrast between the two cultures that different values, which I believe marks the main theme and message of this short story. And I think Justified and Ancient can be compared to the topic of global voices, which deals with different cultures, different global cultures. Um, this short story can perhaps be compared with the text Are You Experienced by William Sutcliffe, um, which also takes place in India, where we follow a guy and a girl visiting, and likely they are also from the West. And the two characters in Are You Experienced both have different opinions on India, but the character Dave could perhaps be compared to Lee because they both have this negative vibe or attitude towards the Indian culture. Um, yeah, so they are a bit alike, these two characters. And in general, there are many similarities between the two stories, and they both deal with the topic of cultural differences. So I think um, one can draw a parallel between the two texts. Yeah, that was my analysis.